Welcome to Art with Mrs. Cap. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the Harlem Renaissance and the art that came out of this rich cultural period. Let's go ahead and look at what was going on during the Harlem Renaissance. So let's look at a brief overview of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a period of rich cross-disciplinary artistic and cultural activity among African Americans. This took place between the end of World War I, right around 1917, and the onset of the Great Depression, and it led up to World War II, which begins to kind of kick off in Europe in the 1930s. Artists associated the movement with asserted pride in Black life and identity, a rising consciousness of inequality and discrimination, and interest in the rapidly changing modern world, many experiencing a freedom of expression through the arts for the very first time. While the Harlem Renaissance may best be known for its literary and performing arts, pioneering figures such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and Ma Rainey may be familiar, sculptors, painters, and printmakers were key contributors to the first modern Afrocentric cultural movement and formed a Black avant-garde in the visual arts. Harlem Renaissance art history. The formation of new African American creative communities was engendered in part by the Great Migration. This was the largest resettlement of Americans in the history of continental United States, mainly from rural southern regions to more populous urban centers in the north, pursuit of jobs, better education, and housing, as well as escape from Jim Crow laws and a life constrained by institutionalized racism. This drove Black Americans to relocate. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 deflated the artistic energy of the period as many people became unemployed and focused on meeting basic needs. Yet, the Harlem Renaissance planted artistic seeds that would germinate for decades. Many of the visual artists associated with the Harlem Renaissance came to participate in the Federal Arts Project from 1935 to 1943, an employment program for artists sponsored by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration. Further, a key legacy for the Harlem Renaissance was the creation of the Harlem Community Arts Center, HCAC. In 1937, part of a cross-country network of arts centers, the HCAC offered hands-on art making led by professional artists and maintained a printmaking workshop. The HCAC was critical in providing Black artists continued support and training that helped sustain a next generation of artists to emerge after the war. In subsequent decades, the Harlem Renaissance inspired new waves of artists that laid critical groundwork for civil rights movements and the Black arts movement. As a final note, women artists were also part of the Harlem Renaissance and participated especially as singers, actors, dancers, and writers. Less well known are the women visual artists of this period. Gaining access to the visual arts scene was more difficult than entry into the performing arts, as the practice of painting and sculpture were particularly not considered gender appropriate or feminine. Two sculptors, Meta Val Warwick Fuller and Augusta Savage, the latter an activist, artist, and director of the HCAC, made their mark during the period, but their work has been largely overlooked and is only now coming into full assessment by art historians. All right, so let's look at Aaron Douglas. He lived from 1899 to 1979. He's known as the father of African American art. He defined a modern visual language that represented Black Americans in new light. Douglas began his artistic career as a landscape painter, but was influenced by modern art movements such as Cubism, in which subjects appear fragmented or fractured, and by the graphic arts, which typically used bold colors and stylized forms. He and other artists also looked towards West Africa for inspiration, making personal connections to the stylized masks and sculptures from Benin, Congo, and Senegal, which they viewed as a link to their African heritage. They also turned to the art of antiquity, such as Egyptian sculptural reliefs. So, popular interest in this happened due to the 1922 discovery of King Tut's tomb. We see like this, influx of Egyptology and Egyptian motifs, not just in the Harlem Renaissance, but also in like the Art Deco and all of these movements that adopted Egyptian style motifs and architecture and so forth. So he really pulled from that inspiration as well as other artists during this time. Additionally, printmakers James Leslie Wells and Hale Woodruff also explored a streamlined approach that drew from African and European influences. All right, so here's a few works by the artists we just mentioned. The two on the outside are by Aaron Douglas, and you can really see that influence of Cubism, but also of graphic art. So there's definitely evident here. You see that fusion. You see there are messages. Especially like you look at this one, you see kind of like these angel figures and a trumpet blowing, and it's called Judgment Day. But then you look to the other side and you see Into Bondage. And if you look closely, of course, you see the chains on their hands. You see that. And you see ships sailing in the distance. So that definitely there's a big message there. But you also see this figure in the foreground looking up. You see like the shaft of light shooting across. So there's a lot of depth in the imagery that he chose to use. In the middle, we have Looking Upward, and you see like this kind of urban city scene, and then this figure that's looking up. So there's a lot of, and this one's a woodcut. So basically you carve into wood, you put ink on that, and then you print it onto paper. Okay, so it's kind of like, think of like a stamp. It's like a stamp, but it's more art. It's more artistic than just a stamp. All right, so you can definitely see there's a lot of symbolism and a message being spoken through each of these works. All right, so some more artists of note. We have the sculptor Richard Barthay, 1901 to 1989. He worked in the realistic style. He represented his subjects in a nuanced and sympathetic light in which Black Americans had seldom been depicted before. Painter Archibald John Motley, 1891 to 1981, began his career during the 1920s as one of the first African American graduates of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In the early part of his career, he created intimate and direct portraits, such as Portrait of My Grandmother. James Vanderzee, 1886 to 1983, a photographer, became the unofficial chronicler of African American life in Harlem, whether through formal posed family photographs in his studio or through photo essays of Harlem's cabinets, restaurants, barbershops, and church services. His body of work documents a growing, diverse, and thriving community. So during this time, we also see the rise of the photographic arts, not just within the Harlem Renaissance, but it is amazing to have, these type of artists operating who were just, they were creating art, but they probably didn't realize just how important the art they were creating was. It was capturing a moment in history and documenting it for, future generations to explore and to see what was going on in Harlem during this time, what, was being developed and so forth. So, of course, we know Renaissance refers to, rebirth. and the art period known as the Renaissance. And this just kind of, these two names came together. Harlem, it was the area where a lot of this started and was fueled. And so we have the Harlem Renaissance. So here's some of the art by some of the artists that we looked at previously. And you have Richmond Barth, Head of a Boy. You've got Archibald John Motley, Portrait of My Grandmother. This is the work that we discussed previously. He's definitely a realism artist, and it's just beautiful work. So you can see that there. If you've taken art before with me, we study realism, and you see that in this. Realism was a period during the 19th century in Europe that was real popular with artists like Manet and Gustave Courbet, and they were very popular in this style of art. And then you see Archibald John Motley mastering this and turning it into his own language. So he takes one of the first styles of modern art that happened in Europe, and he adopts it, and he fuses his own cultural identity and style into it to capture these, this form of realism in a new way with this message. And then above me is a work of art called Beauty. This is also a woodcut. So like, again, it's like a stamp almost. You carve into wood, and then you put your ink or your paint on it, and you print it onto your paper. And you can see that there. All of these works that we discussed today are part of the National Gallery of Art's collection, and the National Gallery of Art is located in DC. If you have the opportunity to go, I highly recommend it. It is a phenomenal museum. I have had the privilege to go many times. I've even taken students there. It's just beautiful, and there's so much in their collection. I still, like in all of my visits, I haven't seen the entire collection. I'm partial to Impressionism, and so I tend to get lost in the Impressionist wing. But they have the decorative arts of America. They have, the Harlem Renaissance. They have traveling shows that come through, and all kinds of things. So I definitely it's not that far away from where I'm located, only like 4 or 5 hours, but it's definitely worth it. If you have a chance to go to DC and you have a chance to visit the National Gallery of Art, please take a look at their collection. Plan to at least spend a day there, or at least a half a day, whatever you can fit in to experience this. But it is really amazing, the quality and caliber of the collection that they have, documenting the Harlem Renaissance and highlighting these artists and these amazing individuals who pioneered a totally new form of American art and really fused their culture and their identity and what was happening in that time with this newfound language to speak to the masses. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Art with Mrs. Cap, and that you will join me again as we explore art in our world, whether it be in America and the US or around the world and throughout history, even ancient history. Thank you for joining me today. See you next time on Art with Mrs. Cap.